Hi there, everyone. Wanted to spend 5 minutes in the Word with you today. And each week we've been starting out with a question. And so the question that I have for you today is, what is at the soul of your most precious relationships? What is driving your most precious relationships? We're continuing through a reading plan that goes with our sermon series, Good and Faithful Stewardship as a Way of Life. And we're seeking to use everything God gives us for the sake of His kingdom. And a lot of times when we think about stewardship, we think of the three T's: time, talent, and treasure. But a lot of times we forget about some of the other resources that God has given us, and one of the most important is relationships. I really tried hard to make that into a T, by the way. I tried the word ties, it just didn't seem to fit. So we just broke the alliteration and we're going with relationships. And how are we using our relationships for the sake of God's kingdom? That's why God puts people into your life, is so that you can use those relationships and you can treasure those relationships with a kingdom mindset. What is at the soul of your most precious relationships? This makes me think of a passage in the Old Testament, 1 Samuel 18, one of the most famous friendships in all of the Bible, the friendship of Jonathan and David. 1 Samuel 18 opens up just after David slays Goliath and chases down the Philistines. And it's such a famous passage of the Bible, but really it's not the most important passage in the scriptures. It really just sets up David's rule, and then David is really setting up the way for Jesus to come. And so right after that incident, we see what it looks like to lay down our own kingdoms in relationship and to focus on God's kingdom. 1 Samuel 18, verses 1 to 5. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. I love what it says there. It was knit. He didn't knit his own soul to David's. It was knit. Who knit it? Well, even my boys, when we were talking about this morning, knew the answer is God. God knits our souls together. And so here are three marks of kingdom advancing relationships. We just read the first one: selfless love at a soul level. Jonathan loved him as his own soul. This is really a mark of the second greatest commandment that Jesus stated: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I'm all of the love that I would naturally direct toward myself in self-preservation and self-care is actually now being focused and channeled outward toward God's people. It continues in verse 2. And Saul took him that day, that is David, and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his own belt. The second mark of kingdom advancing relationships is surrendered rights for the sake of the kingdom. Notice Jonathan is the prince here. He is Saul's son, next in line for the throne. And yet, if you were reading the whole book of 1 Samuel, you would see that the kingdom has been taken away from Saul and has been given to David. David has already been anointed king, and yet he's not yet received the kingdom. And so this is a picture really of surrendering, Jonathan surrendering his position of the throne. He's giving up what would have been his for the sake of God's chosen one. And in relationship, we often need to surrender our rights. We often need to lay down our rights, and not just for the sake of the other person, but for the sake of God's chosen one, Jesus, for the sake of his kingdom advancing in our lives and in the lives of the people around us. Maybe your friend is or your family member is not a follower of Jesus, and you need to lay down your rights for the sake of that person. Maybe it's just to simply show them Christ-centered love, that it's not all about me, it's about the people around me. Laying down your rights, surrendered rights for the sake of the kingdom. Then the third mark of kingdom advancing relationship comes in verse 5. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So God is setting up the way for David to become king. He's giving David favor in the eyes of the people. And that was God's plan, ultimately, to bring forth one from the line of David, who was Jesus, who would set up his eternal kingdom. And so the success of God's kingdom comes over personal achievement. That's the third mark of kingdom advancing relationships. Success of God's kingdom over personal achievement. Do you see those three marks in your relationships? Selfless love at a soul level. Do you care about the souls of those with whom you are in relationship, your family, your friends, your neighbors? Surrendered rights for the sake of the kingdom. Are you holding on to your own rights, or are you letting them go for the sake of the kingdom? And then ultimately seeking the success of God's kingdom over personal achievement. Is his success what you are living for? I want you to consider those things as you approach your relationships this week. You are loved.